What we're looking at in this video is something called arrays. And before we look at what arrays are, we're going to take a look at a problem that will be very hard to solve with variables, and in some cases probably impossible to solve with variables. So let's imagine that we've got a multiplayer game and we've got maybe 5 players in that game, and we want to store each of the players' names. So we could set up variables to do this. We could have player name 1 is, and then we could have the player name. And then we could have player name 2 is, and then store the player name as a string. And so on down for however many players are in the game. Now if I said to you, I've got 2 players, there's nothing wrong with doing that with some variables. If I said I've got 50 players, you'd start to say that's a lot of coding. What about if you had 5,000 players, or if you had a social network with maybe 1 million people or 1 billion people even on your social network? Suddenly that becomes something which humans don't really want to do when they're coding. Even worse, let's say I just want to print out a list or put onto the screen a list of everyone in my game. If you've got 1 million people in the game, that's a lot of work to be typing in if you're going to use variables to do it. And so because of this, we have something called an array. And first we're going to take a little look at what an array looks like just in memory. So before, if you remember, when we drew out the memory, so we would have something that looks a bit like this, and there would be spaces or memory locations. And if I have a variable, then what I'm saying is if I've got variable A and I've stored 15 inside it, it's going to look something like this. And so A is a pointer to a place in memory, and I call that a variable and store 15 in it. Now if I have an array, then what I set up is at the beginning, so within memory, I can say I want to have an array of size 5, and I'm going to call that array players. So players will point to a place in memory, and because I've said it's going to be 5 in length, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's the location. And this variable here will point, it doesn't actually point to each one, it points to the whole thing at once. If I want to reference the first one, then I will say players 0. And so this is the 0th element of the array. So that there, players 0, points to the first element in the array. It's a bit confusing that we start off with a 0. So players 1 will be the second element of the array, and that points to there. And if we go down, so that'll be 1, 2, 3, so this will be 4. So players 4 will be the 5th player, which will be stored in here. And so I can reference each of these separately. Now if you remember back to arrays, I can use arrays plus, if you remember back to when I did for loops, you can use arrays plus a for loop in order to iterate through these automatically and save you having to write a lot of code. And really it's better now to get straight onto an example using the computer rather than written examples. So here we go. What we're going to start off doing is we're going to first of all put these players in just to give you an idea of how we do that. So I set up a list of players, and in some languages it's just useful to note here, when I was talking here I said that it's an array of a fixed length, and so you will say it's an array which is 5 in length. In some languages like C, Java, C#, you have to tell it how long your array is. And it's actually more efficient because the compiler and everything, the computer knows exactly how much RAM that it's going to need in order to store things in that array. In JavaScript, it tries to make things easier for you. So because of that, when you ask for a new array, you don't have to tell it the length. So I just say, give me a new variable which I want called players, and that's going to be an array. And we have it in this weird syntax of new array. I won't get into why we do that. And so for this, as I said, I can talk to each element of the array. So I can assign a value to the 0th element, the first element in my array. And I'm going to put Joe in there. And I can keep on going. So I'm only going to do 5 of these, but you could have as many as you wanted. And as I'm doing these, because they're all going to be the same, it's worth saying that while I'm typing these in, just because I want the program to work this way, it would be perfectly possible in a real piece of software that had players' names, when you type it in, that it then starts adding it into that array. And so you could have a for loop to do this, and it could prompt me every single time for another name that I want to use. But I'm just typing them in so that we can see how we can reference an array. Okay, so the last name we'll have Zoe. So what I now want to do is just show you that I can reference and I can talk to each of the elements of that array. And so I'm going to write out here what the 0th element of the array is, and I'm just going to concatenate to that a new line break as well. And so there we see I've asked it to put out what player 0 is. Player 0 is Joe, and so out pops Joe. If I ask it now for another player, and let's go for the 4th player perhaps, then again it will output my 4th player, and there we see it there. Now what I want to do is perhaps put all of the players out, so I'm just going to comment out these lines of code, and what I want is all 5 players get put out on the screen, so some HTML gets written for every single one of the players. So I is 0, I is less than 5, I plus plus, and so that for loop is saying start off with I, my variable I, my iterator, and that will be 0. Go up until it's 5, so that I get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to iterate by saying I equals I plus 1. And so let's have a look at how this works. So I'm going to put players, and this time it's not players 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's players I. And if you remember, I at the beginning will be 0, and then as I changes, I'm changing the player which I pick out. So players I, and then we got the BR tag at the end there, and just close that. And there we see, now it's come in and it said, okay, players 0, players 1, players 2, players 3, players 4, players 5, and it's printing out each one as we go. So that's really useful. And the thing is, let's say that I had this and this was filled up with 1 million people. All I would have to change is just this one number here to 1 million, and it would go and put 1 million out for me. I wouldn't have to keep on writing that line of code. So arrays are really useful, especially when you're suddenly thinking in your mind, oh, I'm going to have so many variables. You're probably thinking, I'm going to have an array. So what we can have is, we've got an array here of players. Players will have scores, and so it's quite possible we could have 2 arrays, and we could have a second array which will store their scores. So here we go, that's the new array to store the scores, and exactly the same, I'm going to say I is 0, I is got to be less than 5 for me to stop running this for loop, and I'm going to iterate through with I equals I plus 1, or I increment. And so what I'm doing here is, first of all, I'm not going to print out my scores yet because my scores don't have anything inside them. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fill my scores with zeros. So what I've done here is I've gone from 0 to 5, and I've said put 0 into each element of this array. So now my array, instead of being full of nothing, my array is full of zeros. And the next thing I'm going to do, just to show you this works, I'm going to put in some scores. So I'm going to say that the score for 3 is maybe 10, and the score for 4 is perhaps 20. So the score for 3, that will be Charlotte's score, and the score for 4, that will be Brian's score. And now I'm going to do the iteration where I go through and I print all of the scores, and I'm not only going to print the scores, I'm going to print the players' names with the scores. So I is less than 5, And in fact, as I'm doing this, I'm going to comment out all of this code here. So if you do a slash and a star, and then a star and a slash, you see all this stuff here which is green, so that's let me comment out all of this side of code here. So all of this block of code has been commented out. So, because I just don't want to have all those players there. So I'm going here for I is 0, I is less than 5, and I increment. And this time I'm going to print out the player score, and I'm going to print out what their name is. So I've got players I, so that should print out Joe in the first case, has, and then I'm going to concatenate that to scores I, and so that will pluck out his score. Remember, I filled it up with zeros here apart from these two scores. So scores I, and then I'm going to concatenate that to points and put in a break at the end, and that there should be it. And we just notice it's not quite working. Spotted a small little problem here. I'm talking to score here, not scores. And so in here, I just want to change those to scores. Bit of a mistake there. And everything seems to be working fine now. So I've got Joe has 0 points. Little problem there. All of the spacing looks a bit wrong. So I want to put a space in around the has, and I want to put a space in before points. So there we go. Joe has 0 points. Fred has 0 points. Kay's 0. Charlotte has 10 and Brian has 20. Now there is a question why I've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I actually want to go up to a 6th element, and then we get Zoe as well. So there we are. And the final example which I'm going to show you underneath this, let's just do a new line. And so the final example which we're going to take a look at is looking at some ages, and we're going to try and find the average of some ages which are stored in an array. There's another way which I can set up an array, which is, so I've got this way where I say new array, and then I put each of my elements of the array into that array reference. I can actually do it all in one go very, very quickly. And so I use a square bracket, and then I start putting in my numbers or my strings or whatever else. And so here we go. And so these are the ages of some people, perhaps in a class or whatever else you could think of. And I want to find out the average age. So I'm going to need to have a total before I can work out an average. And then I can get the computer to add up each of these by using a simple for loop. So I is 0, and I is less than ages. Now here I could put I is less than, and I could count them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I could put 9 here. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put ages dot length. And so that would take my variable, so my array ages, and by doing dot length, it will tell me what the length of that array is. And that's obviously better, because if I decide to add another age on, then automatically this will change the number here. So it's just a better way to program things. Then increment I up, and my total will be equal to my total plus ages I, like that. And so now I've worked out the total, so I will write out what the total is, and also concatenate on there with a break tag. And so my total is 144. Then I want to work out what my average is. So my average is equal to the total divided by the number of people which I've got, which is the length of my array. So the length of my ages array there. And then I'm going to write out what the average is. Like that. And so I've got a total of 144, I've got an average of 16. If I go and change one of these, so maybe that's not 18, I've made a mistake, it's 17, we see that my average and my total changes. So if I maybe make this 15-year-old was 16, then I go back to 144, that makes sense. If though, even better than that, I decide, oh, I've missed off a name or missed off an age of someone, I can just go here and I can add their age in, and we see this goes absolutely fine because it's using my length of my array for how big this, how many iterations it's got to do. And so here, it wouldn't matter, I could be having 1 million ages or 1 billion ages, it could be a social network with 1 billion people, I've got all of their ages in an array. This for loop here, along with working out the average, that for loop there would happily go through every single one of those ages and work out the average for me. I wouldn't have to be typing in lots of code. So arrays are an immensely useful structure to store scores, ages, names of players, could be storing cars, car names, whatever else. Anything you can think of which needs more than a few variables, you're likely to be wanting to store them in an array.